Trying to get a thumbnail. So in The Righteous Mind, Jonathan Haidt draws some very fascinating conclusions about the righteous mind and what that entails. In chapter 6 in particular, he takes an opportunity to discuss two individuals, Jerry Bentham and Immanuel Kant. You might have heard of them, you might have not, but the fascinating thing is how he categorizes them in order to further his argument, talking about moral psychology in the larger context of why people are divided by politics and religion. Good people. So doesn't say they're bad people, but he kind of says they're bad people. So let's just read and let's analyze this together. Chapter 6. All right, continue on. We're finishing this petty paragraph. So it says, some of his socializing had a calculated feel to it. He valued laughter, and companionship because they were good for his health. How cold and calculated. The safest thing to do is to take advantage of Baron Cohen's two dimensions and say that Kant was one of the most extraordinary systemizers in human history, while being rather low on empathizing, without joining Bentham at the bottom right corner of figure 6.1. All right, let's do that. Getting back on track. I do not want to suggest that utilitarianism and Kantian deontology are incorrect as moral theories just because they were founded by men who may have had Asperger's syndrome. That would be an ad hominem argument, a logical error, and a mean thing to say. Besides, both utilitarianism and Kantian deontology have been enormously generative in philosophy and public policy. They did good, in other words. But in psychology, our goal is descriptive. We want to discover how the moral mind actually works, not how it ought to work. Why not both? And that can't be done. This is a very extreme statement. That can't be done by reasoning, math, or logic. It can be done only by observation, and observation is usually keener when informed by empathy. However, philosophy began retreating from observation and empathy in the 19th century, placing ever more emphasis on reasoning and systematic thought. As Western societies became more educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, the minds of its intellectuals changed. They became more analytic and less holistic. This is true. Utilitarianism and deontology became far more appealing to ethicists than Hume's messy, pluralist, sentimentalist approach. Sure, this trend explains why I found moral psychology so dull when I first studied it in graduate school. Kohlberg had embraced Kant's rationalism. He created a theory in which moral development had one and only one endpoint, a full understanding of justice. This whole approach felt wrong to me. It was over-systemized and under-empathized. It was the true taste restaurant serving up a one-receptor morality. The next section is broadening the palate, and I won't read all of it, but there is some fascinating stuff here. He goes into the difference between different tastes and how different cultures enjoy sweet beverages, like Coca-Cola, and the other ones that are, ours is Coca-Cola, our artificial one, and then there's other ones where it's based on some sort of local fruit, but a country, or like Eskimo tribe, he would say, wouldn't have that kind of beverage because they don't have, access to fruit trees and stuff like that. So this is an interesting theory, and he does argue well that there is a broadening that needs to take place to account for different types of people in different settings. Yes, I agree. But then he goes on to give a moral foundations theory that he came up with a friend. And there's some parts in that are kind of extreme, but he goes on to give this final story, which I think is a good frame, but also has holes. He says that, for now, I just want to demonstrate the theory using the care-harm foundation. Imagine that your 4-year-old son is taken to the hospital to have his appendix removed. You are allowed to watch the procedure from behind a glass window. Your son is given a general anesthetic, and you see him lying unconscious on the operating table. Next, you see the surgeon's knife puncture his abdomen. Would you feel a wave of relief, knowing that he's finally getting an operation that would save his life? Or would you feel pain so strongly that you'd have to look away? If your dolors, pains, outweigh your hedons, pleasures, then your reaction is irrational from a utilitarian point of view, back to Jeremy Bentham. But it makes perfect sense as the output of a module, which is Jonathan Haidt's theory. We respond emotionally to signs of violence or suffering, particularly when a child is involved. Yes, particularly our own child. Sure, I'm sure. We respond even when we know consciously that it's not really violence and he's not really suffering. It's like the Muller-Lyer illusion. We can't help but see one line as longer, even when we know consciously that they are the same length. It's talking about a psychology experiment. As you watch the surgery, you notice 2 nurses assisting in the operation, one older, one younger. Both are fully attentive to the procedure, but the older nurse occasionally strokes your son's head, as though trying to comfort him. The younger nurse is all business. Suppose, for the sake of argument, that there was conclusive proof that patients under deep anesthetic don't hear or feel anything. If that were the case, then what should be your reaction to the two nurses? If you are utilitarian, you should have no preference. The older nurse's actions did nothing to reduce suffering or improve the surgical outcome. If you are Kantian, you'd also give the older nurse no extra credit. She seems to have acted absent-mindedly, or even worse for Kant, she acted on her feelings. She did not act out of commitment to an universalizable principle. But if you are a human, which is interesting, David Hume, so he says, human, if you're a human, then it is perfectly proper for you to like and praise the older nurse. She has so fully acquired the virtue of caring that she does it automatically and effortlessly, even when it has no effect. She is a virtuoso of caring, which is a fine and beautiful thing in a nurse. It tastes good. Okay, and then he summarizes the chapter. The main thing that I have an issue with here is that it also goes to his ridiculous attack against autistic people, because this woman in this surgery, it doesn't account for the menacing principle of people who are sociopaths, which our society could be seen to be rampant with. People who put on a good face or, again, fake it to be accepted or to get by. This woman, you don't know what her thing is about. She could be, and this is like rationalizing, right? What she says is probably cold, and this is my cold autistic self saying this. But I'm saying the fact that you demonize one group of people with no empathy and no second thought, but then you praise another person because they're performing the actions of what is acceptable, but you don't take into account the underlying thoughts and feelings and emotions of that actual person, which you're saying that an autistic person is actually incapable of doing. I'm showing you that it's not true. I am empathizing and understanding that if you're saying that it's just about thinking deeper into a person's motivations and thoughts and actions, what if that lady wants to get a promotion? What if she knows that her boss is watching her also through the glass? And what if she knows that her boss is going to like her more if she shows some empathy and she starts stroking the child's head as he's going through the surgery, and that she seems like a more caring nurse, and that the people tend to like her more because she seems to give out this caring vibe that the newer nurse that she's competing with, who's just cold and all business, but is probably really sharp and on her game when it comes to this surgery and can perform them in her sleep. And say this older nurse actually messes up from time to time, and she messes up and she leaves a scalpel inside of her patients, but during the surgery, she's stroking the head and everybody loves her because they think she's so compassionate, but it's all an act. Who's to say? This says that she's so fully acquired the virtue of caring that she does it automatically and effortlessly, even when it has no effect. She is a virtuoso of caring, which is a fine and beautiful thing, and it tastes good. I happen to find fake empathy and fake compassion to be a bitter taste. And this one-size-fits-all assessment of people and grouping and categorizing them is, very dangerous, because just because a person displays emotions that seem appropriate doesn't mean that you have gotten to that person's actual palate and their tastes and why they're doing the things that they're doing. Because many people put on a show to get ahead, to be accepted, to be liked, yes, same thing. And then behind the scenes, they could be doing some huge major atrocities. So I think it's far more important that we don't look at the two nurses to see who's petting the head of the boy and who's performing the procedure with great attentiveness to be the deciding factor of who's morally right and who's morally wrong. That's ridiculous. We should actually be looking at the track record or the performance of the individual. That nurse who is performing it coldly might be able to learn some things from the other nurse in terms of bedside manner. But we should not just blanketly look at the situation and say this nurse over here is better because she has compassion and the other one is cold. Because if we look at the track record, we'll see how many scalpels this other nurse has left inside of people's bodies and caused them heart attacks and ruptured spleens down later in their life, because she's just absent-minded, but she's putting on a show when she knows it's appropriate because people are watching. So I'm sorry, Mr. Haight, at the end of the day, when you gave your very, very narrow-minded drew your very narrow-minded confusion about Immanuel Kant and Jonathan Bentham, and decided that that's going to be the platform, Jeremy Bentham, the platform that you stand upon to determine whether people are empathetic or not empathetic, and that empathy is the thing that's going to get us all the way when it comes to moral psychology. I think that falls short. But nevertheless, this is a very interesting book. I do recommend that you go and get it. But in conclusion, I'm going to take it a step further, like I said, as promised, in discussing a little bit from the psychic discoveries behind the Iron Curtain. I'm going to read this section here, and then at the very end, I'm going to say the final thought on what is going on here, because Again, like I said, instead of looking at surface level things and making our conclusions about what's moral and what's just and what's right and what we do and we don't know about what's going on with science and how it's gone 200 years down a tangent of rationalism, I think the real danger is how much we've split off down. I said I was going to explain it at the end, didn't I? I'm trying to explain it now. Here we go. Page 77 of this nice little book here. It was strange to be closeted inside the Czech embassy in Moscow, listening to the Soviet scientists tell us about the discovery of vibrations. Perhaps the Russians aren't aware of it, but for decades, mediums deep in trance have been asked, what makes PK, ESP, or trances happen? And from mediums all over the world, having no contact with one another, came almost identical answers, vibrations. The entranced psychics would explain that the human body is made up of an energy body or field that vibrates. If the frequency of vibration of this field is stepped up, energy or information from another dimension can come through us, the medium said. But until the Burr rabbit's discovery of the body's invisible energy fields, no one knew exactly what it was they were to vibrate or how to do it. An English medium, Grace Rosher, predicted that we would soon have high-frequency instruments to enhance ESP powers by upping the vibrations of our energy fields. The Soviets claim they've already devised machines to create magnetic and other kinds of artificial fields that increase psychic power, particularly telepathy and PK. See Chapter 10. According to Dr. Ravitz, in the 1951 Yale Journal of Biology and Medicine, the action of the sun and moon also affect the body's force field. Dr. Sergeyev, S-E-R-G-E-Y-E-V, Dr. Sergeyev, that's how I'm going to say it. The most favorable time for PK is during magnetic disturbances of the Earth caused by sunspot activity. The Soviets say that three things affect our force fields and thus our psi power. 1, fields produced by machines. 2, natural fields produced by sun, moon, and probably planets. 3, most importantly, human emotions. Not only is the psychic's emotional effect on her own force field involved, the Soviets told us, but the emotions of the observers play a part too. This has been a very difficult point to get over to some scientists, Edward Nomov said. They expect human beings to turn on like machines. They don't seem to realize their own force fields might be affecting Mrs. Mikhailova. She's a very excitable and nervous personality. Some of these scientists, with no understanding of psychology or bioinformation, are radiating unpleasantness and suspicion, which she picks up. We're usually able to demonstrate PK anytime, but with unpleasant people, it may take Mrs. Mikhailova as much as 7 hours to be able to turn the compass needle. Their negative influence is not helpful. Surrounded by friendly people, the compass may move within 5 minutes. The human force field, the story of the dynamic cocoon of energy surrounding us, had only begun. The Soviets not only had Dr. Sergeyev's detectors to chart this surround at a distance, they also seem to have a method of photographing it. See chapters 16, 17, and 18. What was beginning to emerge is a new picture of the human being, not an alienated creature, but a being enmeshed in an ebb and flow with everyone and everything around him. The pulsing magnetic fields of machines, earth, moon, and sun, the thoughts and emotions of ourselves and other people, all affect the force fields of our bodies, and in turn, the Russians say, our psychic powers. Dr. Sergeyev made another baffling discovery. He set up his detectors some distance from the body of a clinically dead man. No brain waves, no heartbeat could be recorded, but the detectors leaped into action. 4 yards from the man's lifeless body, the electromagnetic force fields were pulsing. It seemed energy was being released. The famous psychic and clairvoyant Eileen Garrett, president of the Parapsychology Foundation of New York, has reported seeing spirals of energy leaving the bodies of the recently dead up to 3 days after death. Were Sergeyev's detectors picking up the same phenomenon? Even stranger, the detector graphs from the clinically dead body were similar to the detector records made when Mikhailova caused objects to move at a distance. In both cases, PK and death, energy seemed to be released. Quote, with Dr. Sergeyev's new research, said Dr. Zdenek Radek. Oh my gosh, it tells you how to say it. Thank you. Very helpful. Radek, a prominent Czech scientist connected with the Prague Military Institute. We've left behind the old approach of observing telekinesis from the outside only. Now we can begin to detect and record these extraordinary human powers with instruments. It's a first step toward understanding and harnessing this new energy. One of the Western observers, Dr. Jurgen Kiel of the University of Tasmania, wrote, Russian and Czech scientists at the meeting viewed psychic phenomena as physical events which eventually will be controlled like those in orthodox sciences. The Russian approach is most impressive and deserves serious interest from the Western countries. One thing seems clear about the research on Mikhailova and all those records of startling changes in brainwaves, heartbeat, and electromagnetic fields. The debunkers of Nelia, which is her first name, really should think of something less archaic than magnets and threads. Changing your brainwaves so drastically with threads or magnets would be a supernormal feat in itself. What was behind the story of fraud involving Mikhailova? Was it all fabrication? Nelia Mikhailova did not spring full-blown as a PK medium on the Soviet science scene. Several years earlier, Nelia had been convalescing from an illness in a Leningrad hospital. To pass the time, she took up embroidery. One day, when the nurse brought her a bag of multicolored embroidery thread, Nelia, without glancing at it, dipped her hand into the bag. She'd wanted claret, yellow, and green thread. When her hand came out, those were the colors she held. Suddenly, she realized she'd selected them from many colors in the dark bag without seeing them. Her hand had somehow recognized color. Back home, she noticed a newspaper article about Rosa Kuleshova, who reportedly could see colors with her hands. I can do this too, Nelia thought excitedly. Going for a checkup, she mentioned the idea to her doctors, S.G. Feinberg and G.S. Belyev. It is one of the typical ironies of science that Dr. Feinberg, a confirmed skeptic about eyeless sight and psychic ability in general, ended up being a pioneer and confirming that such abilities exist. Nelia's discovery, and there's footnotes in here throughout, endnotes throughout with sources of these events. Nelia's discovery of her new talents soon led her to one of the greatest physiologists in Russia, Dr. Leonid Vasilyev. Dr. Vasilyev carried out painstaking tests of her ability and had her demonstrate her paranormal talents before scores of scientists. In 1964, a special conference of top-level scientists was called to observe Mikhailova's demonstration, and according to the January issue of Smina, this is a publication, it was a success. Dr. Vasilyev speculated about how skin sight could happen. If Mikhailova's hands could see, perhaps some sort of X energy was pouring out of them. If there was an energy, perhaps it could do other things beside eyeless sight. In the midst of a skin sight experiment with Mikhailova, Vasilyev recalled that a famous Greek researcher, Dr. A. Tanagras, had found one of his subjects could make the needle of a compass turn by holding her hands above it. On the spur of the moment, Vasilyev dug out a compass, placed it in front of Nelia, and encouraged her to try. She'd never attempted this before, and of course she'd had no chance to make any advanced preparations. She held her hands above the compass. The needle turned. Dr. Vasilyev had discovered a talented PK subject. He embarked on a whole series of PK tests. Soon, he found Mikhailova could also move other objects by PK at a distance. Nelia Mikhailova, a little girl who'd been out in the front lines of the battlefield during the siege of Leningrad, now found herself on the front lines of the struggle to uncover new potentials in the human being. She did many PK demonstrations for scientists. On one occasion, university researchers asked Mikhailova to change the flow of sand in an hourglass. Instead of changing the flow of sand according to reports, she moved the hourglass itself at a distance. Before Nelia's PK was thoroughly tested, the axe fell. Nelia was accused of exchanging money on the black market. Whether she actually did, we don't know. But black marketeering in Russia was almost as commonplace as speeding in the West. We were often accosted by black marketeers on Gorky Street in Moscow, in Leningrad, and in Kiev, even inside the hotels, especially in elevators. Soviets tried to make deals for shoes, clothes, or money. Despite its being commonplace, fraudulent conversion of funds is a serious offense in Russia. Mikhailova woke up with a prison sentence. Mikhailova wound up with a prison sentence. Only the intervention of a scientist as prestigious as Dr. Vasilyev, a recipient of the Order of Lenin, one of the highest honors of the Soviet Union, managed to save her. He pleaded she must have been mentally unbalanced at the time she made the deal, if she did make it, and apparently the authorities permitted her to be placed in a hospital instead of a prison. The accusations of fraud had nothing to do with her telekinetic abilities. Dr. Radek advised us. No magnets have ever been detected on Mrs. Mikhailova's body, he said. The Metronomy Institute of Russia that studied Nelia detected only an increased magnetic field near her body, but no hidden magnets. However, instead of examining this phenomenon more closely, they simply assumed there might be hidden magnets, said Radek. Everyone has a force field around his body, but Nelia's is stronger than most. All the scientists who studied her found this, but the scientists at the Metronomy Institute were stuck in rut thinking. It never occurred to them that Nelia's ability to change her unusual field might be the basis of her PK. Certainly, an impressive roster of Soviet scientists agreed with Radek, Sergeyev, and Naumov that Nelia's PK was not a fraud. Dr. Radek has tested Mikhailova personally and reported the tests in Trek Pravda, another publication. I visited the Mikhailova-Kulagin family the evening of February 26, 1968. Mr. Blazek, an editor friend, was with me. Also a physician, Dr. J.S. Zverev, and Dr. Sergeyev. Her husband, an engineer, was also present. Dr. Zverev gave Mrs. Mikhailova a very thorough physical examination. Tests with special instruments failed to show any indication whatever of magnets or any concealed object. We checked the table thoroughly and also asked Mrs. Mikhailova frequently to change position at the table. We passed a compass around her body and the chair and table with negative results. I asked her to wash her hands. After concentrating, she turned the compass needle more than 10 times. Then the entire compass and its case, a matchbox, and some 20 matches at once. I placed a cigarette in front of her. She moved that too at a glance. I shredded it afterwards, and there was nothing inside it. In between each set of tests, she was again physically examined by the doctor. I placed my gold ring on the table. It moved faster than all the other objects. I was told that whatever this energy is, it affects gold more than any other metal. The gold ring she made move was taken by me from my finger and put on the table. She passed her hands over it, and the ring moved toward her. Threads or other attachments were out of the question. The matches and matchbox belonged to us, and Mrs. Mikhailova had no chance to prepare them. We asked her to make the matches move not only toward her, but also away from her. We also asked her to move only one match specified by us from the whole group of matches. According to Dr. Radek, she did so. Later, we put 2 compasses before her and asked her to move only one of them. She did. Her PK energy can be directed by her will, Radek says. I chose some glass and china objects from the buffet and put them on the table. I took cups, small plates, a glass, salt cellar from the cupboard myself. They were selected by myself, and she had no opportunity to prepare them. They weighed about 8 ounces each. Mrs. Mikhailova made them move as well. On request, she would induce motion in the objects while they were on a chair or on the floor. Fraud was impossible, as she was sitting in a fully illuminated room controlled by Dr. Zverev and Dr. Sergeyev, Mr. Blazek, and myself. Dr. Radek told us. We did another curious test. We filled a glass bowl full of cigarette smoke and placed it upside down in front of her. At a distance, she could cut the mass of smoke in half, as if it were a solid substance. Here's the important part. After doing these series of tests, Mrs. Mikhailova was utterly exhausted. There was almost no pulse. She could scarcely move, and her face was pale and drawn. She'd lost close to 4 pounds in half an hour. According to Dr. Zverev's reports, the EEG showed intense emotional excitement. Her heart action was arrhythmic. There was high blood sugar, and the endocrine system was disturbed. Her whole organism was weakened, as if from a tremendous stress reaction. She had lost the sensation of taste, had pains in her arms and legs, couldn't coordinate, and felt dizzy. Later, she reported that her sleep was disturbed. See Appendix A, 5 and 6. I think that's where I was going to end. See if you can guess the problem that I have with this. We're so hungry to figure out the righteous mind and still putting it in these silly buckets of politics and religion. And anything that doesn't fit neatly in these buckets, we other it, as we saw with even Mr. Haight's description and discussion of people on the autism spectrum. And then we see that he discusses the issue being with someone who he respects, David Hume, and his work of deciding that moral psychology should be based on compassion and empathy, and that this was halted by the advancement of the rationalists like Jeremy Bentham and Immanuel Kant, and their very systematic approach to analyzing these things and moving forward with science in that way. And he says that it's gone on a 200-year tangent away from what he felt was important, which was having empathy. I do very much agree with that in terms of where science needs to be checked a little bit, and the limits of where our rational minds get us when we are absent or devoid of empathy. But I do not agree that that is demonstrated in just individuals that have different mental neuro ways of interacting with society. But this is where it demonstrates where we're off the mark with that heavily. Because a lot of these experiments, again, this is going on and demonstrating things that are going on in the 1960s and such. I've demonstrated on the channel with other resources that show the Freedom of Information Act files from the CIA reading room and our intelligence agencies that we've been heavily researching these things. and psychology and scientific studies of psychology and the human experience and what people can do have been heavily, heavily studied, right? But these are not mainstream, at least not in our country. And this is telling a lot of those studies and the things that have been going on behind the curtain. But I would go further to say that the issue is that, again, science makes a spectacle of the people who are more in tune with the intuitive realm, the inside realm, the introverted, the capabilities of the introverted person, who, again, aren't incapable of reading other people, that are actually hyper aware of and able to detect and pick up on things and energy. And this goes so far as to say that, you know, it could be photographed, it can be picked up on machines, that there's been machines that can actually influence different people's fields and our vibrations and all of these things that we're still not up to date and up to speed in talking about and studying here. And then the way that they go about testing these people to the point of you losing weight, 4 pounds in a half hour, being completely exhausted, tested time and time again by scientists over and over again to prove that these things exist, to fill their satisfaction. And what they do with that is not to go on and help other people to figure out what we can do and move forward as a society, but to covet that information and to keep it private and to use it and to militarize it and such, and to put it into movies so that we can, you know, demonstrate these super soldiers and all these things, and then put chips into human beings and move forward with advancements in society that are so critical and are so important that we need to be paying attention. And we're merging technology with human consciousness now at that stage. And still behind the scenes, there's all these different things and studies that have been going on about what humankind and human beings can do. But we have absolutely no say in the humanity of the way that they're going about those things. I think that how they describe the story of how they tested this psychic woman is just as atrocious and just as disgusting as the way Jonathan Haidt describes these men who had made these advancements in rational science in terms of moral, systematic moral studies. We need to not keep pointing fingers at, you know, which side or which camp is right, but we need to pay more attention to what we already know and what information and advancements have already been discovered, and to put more eyeballs on how we're going about that. It needs to be humane in how we're going about these studies. It needs to be not some secret intelligence thing where we're pulling out people and we're holding them in cages and forcing them to do our tests like lab rats and things like that. And then the information needs to be made public so that we can see that we actually have more within our wheelhouse that we can do as a society to advance, so that, you know, the norms of our taste palettes of what flavors that we're into in society and things like that, it could be heavily influenced by us knowing and having access to different abilities. That's a whole nother conversation, but I think I just want to point out that the tangent that science has been on over the last 200 years since David Hume and his work is at issue because it has become so secretive, and scientists have been allowed to just do all kinds of things without a moral compass and a moral code. And I think that's where we need to be looking in terms of understanding that, yes, it has gone down a tangent, and we don't even know exactly how far that tangent has gone because these things are behind the Iron Curtain. And also just that we ourselves continue to place weird judgments on things that we don't understand. So even if we were to first become confronted with the fact that people who have different ways of thinking, different neural capacities, are not to be dismissed outright by some stereotypical assertions that have been made by psychologists that, like it says, they've been bedeviled for years by autism, but that means that they shouldn't be speaking on it without fully understanding it. But once you realize actually what those people are capable of and what all different intuitive people based on their birth charts are capable of, and what they've already demonstrated and proven time and time again to science, we need to make that mainstream, and we need to put protections in place so that these people aren't like poked and prodded at like lab rats. And this opens up a really big moral psychological question that, again, I think is very interesting to study and also to look at in the lens of these two books here in particular. So I also recommend this one for you if you're interested. And I think that's all I have for now. This is probably super long, but thank you so much. If you made it to the end of this video, please stick around or let me know what you thought, and I will see you in another one. Take care.